Before we go to the example below, let's go first to the different sources of obligation. Now, there are five sources of obligations. We have law, contracts, quasi contracts, delict, and quasi delicts. Now, for law, what we mean here is all obligations arising from law are not supposed to be presumed. They must be in writing and they must be acts of Congress, gaya ng pag-aralan natin last time. So, the law creates certain obligations that are written, and these are not presumed. For example, the obligation to give support is written in the law. Like yung parents are required to give financial and other support to their children for education, sustenance, transportation, and all of these things. Also, marriage. In marriage, the couple is obliged actually to live under the same roof and be together. Of course, may exception doon, but at the end of the day, these are obligations arising from law. Now, what we mean when we say it must not be presumed is that it must be written. Kailangan nakasulat doon sa batas kung ano yung mga obligasyon na to. If yung obligasyon, if something is not written, it is not your obligation. If it's not written in the law, it's not your obligation under the law. But again, there can be other sources of obligations. Okay, so that is the first kind. The second source of obligation that we will be discussing are contracts. Now again, our subject matter is obligations and contracts. So we will, if you can see, the subject matters that will be covered by this subject is from the more general term obligation to the more specific contracts. So in contracts, or rather, these contracts are the law between the parties, and they must be complied with in good faith. Now, what do we mean when we say contracts are the law between the parties? Now, sa mga kontrata kasi, meron tayong mga bagay na pinag-agrihan o there are certain stipulations doon sa contract, like kung saan magbabayad, kung sino ang magbabayad, kung paano ang bayaran, kung ano ang i-deliver, all of these things, these are what we call stipulations in a contract. And these contracts are binding between the two parties who made them. So yung kontrata, be it oral or written, binding yon sa dalawa o higit pang partidos doon sa kontrata. So in a sense, parang yung itong contracts na ito ay ang batas sa pagitan ng dalawang tao. Now, what do we mean when we say this is the law that governs the relationship of the two or more parties in a contract? It means na all stipulations must be complied with in good faith. So dapat lahat ng laman ng kontrata dapat masunod, ay kailangan sundin ng bawat party doon sa kontrata. Now, as we will learn later on, these contracts, itong mga kontratang ito must not be contrary to law. Hindi dapat sila lumalabag sa batas, otherwise that they are illegal. So they must not be against the law. Another source of obligations are what we call quasi contracts. Now, they are quasi contracts or like contracts. Yun actually yung literal na translation ng quasi contracts, like contracts. They are like contracts in a sense that they involve two people. But they are not contracts because it is unilateral. ibig sabihin, it is made without an actual agreement between two people. Hindi sila nag-agree to do something. It is just the voluntary action of another. So in this but even so, it is a source of obligation because it is written in the civil code. Now, what are the kinds of quasi contracts? Now we have two kinds of quasi contracts. We have nexorum gesture and solution indemnity. However you pronounce these two things, ano? Pero basically, these two quasi contracts are based on lawful, unilateral, and voluntary acts. Ngayon, pag sinabi natin lawful, kailangan hindi siya labag sa batas, 'di ba? Pangalawa, kailangan unilateral lang siya. It is the action of one party for the benefit of another. Pero not necessarily nag-agree sila, hindi. They did not agree, kaya nga siya hindi contract. And it must be voluntary. Ibig sabihin, hindi siya inutusan ng second party to do something. Ano? So, what are these two kinds of quasi-contracts? We have, first we have negotiorum hestio. Now, the definition of negotiorum hestio is voluntary administration of someone else's property or affairs. Nang wala niya without his consent o nang hindi siya pumapayag, which gives rise to an obligation to reimburse. Now, let's discuss that one by one. Now, voluntary administration of property or affairs. Kumbaga, someone took care of the property or yung mga affairs ng isang tao while he is away or while he is not there. For example, may garden yung kapitbahay nyo, but then again, iniwan nila yon for a 1-month vacation. Ngayon, wala namang sinabi sa'yo na wala namang sinabi sa inyo na diligan niyo yung halaman nila or what. Walang binili. So, but you notice na namamatay na yung mga halaman nila. So, what did you do? Tinanggalan mo ng damo, diniligan mo, nilagyan mo ng fertilizer. And then, lumago siya. Now, in that case, someone else is benefited. Tama? Yung mga kapitbahay mo. But did you ask something, but did they ask you to do that? Hindi, di ba? So, it is a case of negotiorum gesture. Kasi wala silang consent na gawin mo yon. But anyway, it benefited them. Na benefit sila doon. So, what is their obligation? Their obligation is actually to reimburse you for what you spent. What are the expenses that you made doon sa kanilang taniman. Now, again, let's go back to the definition of negotiorum gestio. Voluntary administration of property. You took care of yung properties nila while they're away without their consent. Wala nga sila, so how can they consent to it, di ba? And anyway, it is voluntary. And it gives rise to the obligation to reimburse. So, they have to reimburse you for your expenses doon sa pag take care mo doon sa mga halaman nila. Another example. For example, yung nasusunog yung bahay ng kapitbahay mo. Wala sila diyan. But anyway, you inapula mo yung apoy, etc., gumamit ka ng tubig, and other necessary expenses. Ngayon, is it lawful? Yes, because kung nasusunog na nga, what's the problem with that if you help someone, di ba? That's lawful. It is unilateral because hindi naman nila sinabing apulain mo yung apoy, but you did anyway. And it is voluntary. It is voluntary kasi ginawa mo yon out of nothing. Hindi mo siya hindi siya part ng isang contract, etc. So that is an example of negosyorum gestio. Now, in that case, ano yung obligation ng may-ari ng bahay? Yung obligation ng may-ari ng bahay is to actually reimburse you um, for what you paid doon sa pag-apula ng apoy. Now, let's change the facts. Balik tayo dun sa unang case, yung uh, halaman ng kapitbahay mo. What if nung umalis sila, they actually said, uy, pakitignan naman yung halaman namin. I will pay you habang wala kami. Is that a quasi-contract? Well, technically hindi na because it is already contractual. Meron na kayong contractual relationship. Meron ng meron ng consent on both parties. Sabi nga natin kanina, sa negosyorum gestio without the consent of the owner. So, ang source ng obligation kapag sa ganon, it is already a contract. So, ang source na ng obligation doon, contract na. Not necessarily quasi-contract. Kahit na oral lang yon, contracts can be oral or written. So, that is quasi-contract. That's negosyorum gestio. Now, solusyo in debiti naman is for mistaken payments or erroneous payments. Now, according dito sa solution debiti, any payment made, a person who received payment by mistake is obligated to return it. Kumbaga, kung meron kang natanggap na bayad na sobra or not due sa'yo, your obligation is to return it. Now, what do we mean by this? For example, may bumili sa'yo ng sardinas. That's 50 pesos. For example lang. That's 50 pesos. Ang binigay sa'yo ay 1,000. Now, akala nung may-ari 100 lang. So, nung sinuklan mo siya ng 950, binalik sa'yo yung 900. Now, is that a mistaken payment? Yes. May binayad sa'yo na sobra. So, what is your obligation? According dito sa rule on quasi contracts on solution debiti, you need to return the 900 na mistakenly paid sa'yo. Or, for example, may nagabot sa'yo ng pera. Bayaran ko utang ko, sabi. Pero when you realize later on, wala pala siyang utang sa'yo, or worse, hindi pala ikaw yung pinagkautangan niya. So, do you have the obligation to return the money? Yes, because that is a mistaken payment. Your obligation there is to return the money to whomever it is due. Now, kung titignan natin itong rule on quasi contract, simple lang ang rason dito. Why this is a source of obligation. So, negosyorum gestio, if they administered your property or your affairs, you need to pay them. Sa solution debiti, if you receive a mistaken payment, you need to return it. The principle here sa quasi contracts is that no one must be unjustly enriched. No one must unjustly enrich himself or herself at the expense of others. Hindi dapat the lesson there is hindi dapat tayo nakikinabang unjustly sa mga bagay na that is not due to us, na hindi naman para sa atin. So, yun yung concept ng quasi contracts. Another source of obligation is delict or crime. Basically crime, anything that is punishable under the revised penal code or special penal laws natin. So, sabi diyan, every person who is criminally liable is also civilly liable. So, 'di ba, kapag nakukulong yung isang tao, madalas hindi lang siya about yung pagkakulong per se, but there are also civil liabilities that come with it. So, another source of obligation yon. For example, uh, ang sabi sa decision ng court ay you need to pay the victim, indemnify the victim doon sa amount na ninakaw. For example, nagnakaw ng 100,000 worth ng pera. So, if the court says na, oh, ibalik mo yung pera, or rather, kung sinabing ibalik yung pera, you need to return it because that's your obligation based on your criminal liability for robbery or theft. Bukod pa yon doon sa penalty na penalty of imprisonment. So that's delict. And finally, we have quasi delicts. Your obligation to reimburse someone for the commission of a quasi delict. Now, it is quasi delict or is otherwise known as criminal negligence. Ito yung mga ang mga examples nito ay reckless imprudence resulting in homicide, reckless imprudence resulting in damage to property, mga ganon. Reckless imprudence resulting to slight physical injuries, mga ganon. These are what we call quasi-delicts. And under the law, you are required to reimburse or you are required to pay someone whom you committed a quasi-delict to. For example, may nasiraan ng property, you need to reimburse the amount of the property that was destroyed. Kung namatay yung isang tao, you need to pay indemnity sa pamilya niya for loss of earning capacity, di ba? Kasi paano naman mabubuhay yung mga anak niya if you are not required to pay a certain amount para pang support sa pamilya niya. So yun yung basis natin ng obligations. So again, there are 5 sources of these obligations. We have law, contracts, quasi-contracts, delict, and quasi-delicts.